Hello, I'm Haldane Dodd, Executive Director of the Air Transport Action Group. I'd like to take the next 20 minutes to answer this question. How can global aviation reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050? I'll do this by taking you through a series of underlying questions, but first, a bit of background. In October, the global civil aviation industry became one of the first sectors to commit to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, in line with the Paris Agreement's stretch goal at a global level. This was an increase in ambition from earlier long-term goal. Importantly, the commitment is backed by almost all the world's airlines, aircraft operators, airports, air traffic management providers, and supported by the major names across the supply chain. The commitment outlines that the goal will be underpinned by a transition away from fossil fuels by mid-century, the research, development, and deployment of both evolutionary and revolutionary technologies, continued improvements in operational efficiency, and the use of carbon removals to deal with any residual emissions in 2050. Now, we'll explore these in a few minutes, but I'd like to emphasize that the industry did not take the adoption of this goal lightly. Aviation is one of the hardest sectors to tackle, and we wanted to make sure that net zero was feasible. It's a significant challenge, but it can be done. When planning a net zero pathway, it's important to see where you have come from and where you are heading. Aviation has always prioritized improvements in efficiency. It's almost our business as usual mantra. Looking to our past, a flight that you take today will produce less than half the CO2 that the same flight would have in 1990. At a global scale, that means we've already achieved efficiency improvements that get us to the blue dotted line instead of the red one. These improvements will continue and hopefully accelerate. But we also know that our carbon emissions, based on expected growth and connectivity improvements, will hit almost 2 gigatons of CO2 in 2050. Our key mission with this new commitment is to work out how we get from there down to net zero emissions. I wanted to illustrate the detail we explored in order to understand where the carbon reductions will come from. Now, over a period of 3 years, 70 experts from across the industry split the task into 5 working groups, looking at traffic forecasts, developments in efficiency and innovation, sustainable aviation fuels, and each of these working groups detailed many dozens of forecasts and potential pathways leading to hundreds of possible outcomes. Now, we concentrated on 3 illustrative scenarios, pulling levers in different ways to meet a net zero carbon emissions goal at a global level. These are outlined in our Waypoint 2050 report. So I want to spend the next minutes going through 10 key questions that may be triggered when we say that aviation is going net zero by 2050. The first and most obvious is, can it be done? And the answer is, it is a significant challenge, but it is possible, and without resorting to significant use of offsetting or carbon removal. The 3 Waypoint scenarios show that depending on which levers you pull, it can be achieved through advances in new technology and a shift to sustainable aviation fuels. So for example, scenario 2 here illustrates a future where technologies don't move beyond evolutionary improvements in conventional models, and most of the emissions reductions must be achieved through sustainable aviation fuels. Scenario 3 shows the split if we are able to rapidly deploy radical technologies such as hydrogen and electric aircraft. And scenario 1 falls in between the two. Each of the scenarios envisions a small amount of market-based measures to deal with residual emissions in 2050. But it's important to note, even if some technologies don't scale rapidly, we wanted to ensure that net zero was possible anyway. Question 2 is about offsets. At the moment, even though efficiency is improving all the time, the only way to significantly deal with aviation CO2 emissions today is to offset that travel. Aviation is, in fact, the only sector in the world to have a global, market-based measure to deal with the growth in CO2 emissions in the near term, the CORSIA Agreement, reached through the United Nations Specialized Agency, ICAO. But we also recognize that this is just a stopgap measure in the near term, whilst new technologies and sustainable fuels scale up. By the time we get to 2050, we'll need to deal with remaining CO2 emissions we have not been able to cut in sector. Aviation will have to turn to natural climate solutions and carbon removals technologies, which will be a key part of the world's response to climate change. The IPCC recognizes the vital role these options play. Now, there's a lot of buzz around new forms of propulsion, including electric and hydrogen as options for aircraft. A lot of work is taking place around the world right now, and we can expect to see some form of electric propulsion, either from batteries or hydrogen fuel cells, in the smallest commercial aircraft, 9 to 19 seats, between 2025 and 2030. A few years later, these options may be available in a larger model aircraft in the regional category. But there are significant challenges to overcome, both the technology of the aircraft and the engines themselves, as well as the distribution and production of green hydrogen, which will be needed. Potentially a few years later, direct hydrogen options may be available in the short-haul market. Now, a lot of challenges remain, but this matrix is a view of how these new forms of propulsion and energy can fit into the fleet over the coming decades. However, we also need to point out that a majority of carbon emissions come from medium and long-haul flights, which make up 3/4 of CO2 emissions, and it will rely on liquid sustainable aviation fuel for decades to come. So that leads us to the next question. Will shifting to sustainable fuels require large amounts of land or impact food or water use? The answer is no. Aviation has adopted a sustainability-first approach, and the analysis we have done removes all unsustainable sources, as well as limiting the availability of feedstocks that may also have uses in other industries. It's a very conservative estimate. Today's SAF comes mainly from waste oils and lipids, and over the next few years, other waste sources will start coming on stream. Some use of cover crops can start being seen. These are grown in rotation with food crops and help regenerate the soil in off years. And eventually, sustainable fuel for aviation made literally from low-carbon electricity will become viable and take on a more important role. Put a different way, you can see how these pathways will evolve over the course of the next 30 years. We're already flying on SAF today, very small quantities, but it's a solution which we know works, reduces CO2 emissions by 80% or so compared to fossil fuels, and will improve to possibly 100% carbon reduction. It does not require new aircraft or changes to engines, and it is scalable. The biggest challenge today is cost, and that brings us to our next question. Will flying cost more in the future? This is a challenging question to answer because there are a number of variables that go into the price of an airline ticket. And efficiency improvements have resulted in significant reductions in the cost of travel and connectivity over the past few decades. But we know that sustainable aviation fuel does cost more than fossil fuel today, up to 2 to 4 times as much. Analysis shows that the cost can come down as these technologies mature. This chart illustrates that. If you add in the cost of carbon, which is expected to increase, the cost of SAF will fall to within the spread of jet fuel prices that the industry has experienced over the last 20 years. Aside from the SAF question, there may also be some cost differentials with radical new technologies like hydrogen and electric, but this may also be somewhat offset with efficiency gains. Now, if I were to make a prediction, I would say that the cost of flying may increase a little bit, but we will still be able to connect the world and extend the benefits of travel to more citizens. Question 6 looks at whether we are waiting until 2050 to make any kind of improvements. While a lot of the major technology breakthroughs are not available today, there are a lot of things we're able to do and implement right now by improving operations, flying better, working together to implement small efficiencies, putting our aircraft on a diet by lightweighting seats and other equipment, and importantly, modernizing air traffic management systems with opportunities such as space-based navigation. Each of these efforts add to the overall efficiency improvements across the system and are an important venue for early action. In addition, we're already implementing sustainable aviation fuels, with over 365,000 commercial flights so far using a small proportion of this fuel. More production is coming on stream rapidly now, with 14 new facilities opening in the next 3 or 4 years and a number of additional projects producing SAF before 2030. In fact, with recent commitments from airlines for up to $14 billion worth of offtake agreements, as well as moves like the European Union Refuel Initiative and the US government's commitment to support 10% of fuel supply with SAF by 2030, we can expect over 6% of aviation fuel in 2030 to be SAF. And this is just what's been announced so far. Now, in every Waypoint 2050 scenario, we will need substantial quantities of SAF, up to 445 million tons or 550 billion litres per annum by 2050. As I outlined, we know where this could come from and what it will take to make it happen, but can it happen fast enough? We're going to need a concerted effort by governments and the energy sector to support this. But if you look at the trajectory of the solar and wind sectors have developed, and then add in the urgency of the climate challenge, this is absolutely doable, with most of the action needed in the 2030 to 2050 period. Aviation will need low-carbon electricity for multiple uses in the next decades. Direct use in smaller battery aircraft like the commuter segment of the 9 to 19 seats. to produce green hydrogen for use in some larger aircraft, and as part of the power-to-liquid SAF production process. In all, this could need between 8 to 18% of the currently anticipated low-carbon electricity production in 2050. However, it is likely that aviation demand will increase overall supply of low-carbon electricity. So, why should governments support the energy transition in aviation? Our analysis shows that in order to meet our pathway towards net zero 2050, between 5,000 and 7,000 SAF production facilities may be needed, although there is some consolidation that may take place. This allows energy industries to flourish in countries around the world. In fact, almost every country on Earth could become an energy provider, a more decentralized system than the 22 countries which produce 90% of oil today. And because we fly everywhere, local opportunities could supply local airports. This will cost. Investment will be needed of up to $1.45 trillion over 30 years. But when you annualize that figure, it's around 6% of typical yearly oil and gas capital expenditure. And importantly, this new energy industry will create or sustain up to 14 million jobs, 90% of which are in the supply chain for SAF production. And finally, what support does the industry need to make net zero aviation a reality? Well, we need support from governments, the right policy environments focusing on long-term thinking and smart regulation, working with the industry. We need governments to agree a long-term goal for aviation at the 41st ICAO Assembly next year, ensuring a strategic climate response is not just coming from the industry, but is backed up by global government vision. The energy industry also needs to get serious about the transition away from fossil fuels and work with us as customers to deliver significant quantities of SAF. And both research institutions and our customers can also play a supportive role. Customers, for example, can offset their travel through high-quality UN-backed projects, or indeed more and more airlines are starting to work with big corporates to allow them to help in the scale-up for SAF for their flights. So, in conclusion, we found through the Waypoint process that industry long-term goal of net zero CO2 from aviation globally by 2050 is challenging, but it is achievable. We will need a significant scale-up of sustainable aviation fuel, including investment to help build this new energy source. New technology, such as electric and hydrogen aircraft, need accelerated research and development, but they could enter service around 2035 on short-haul routes. Operations and infrastructure efficiencies are vital for early action and to maintain capacity efficiency in the future. And offsetting is important in the near term, but net zero may still rely on some carbon removal options. Now, one bonus question for you. Where can I get more information? The Waypoint 2050 report is available on our website, alongside the companion Fueling Net Zero report, which outlines the SAF pathways in great detail. And the industry's Fly Net Zero commitment is also online. Now, we welcome all help to make this ambitious commitment a reality. Thank you.
Aviation has an ambitious goal: to make civil air transport net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. A goal based on science and in line with the Paris Agreement aim to keep the warming effect of climate change under 1.5 degrees. Making aviation a net zero carbon industry is a big challenge, but it is possible. Here's how we will make it happen. From a flight taken 30 years ago to the same flight you take today, improved efficiency means less than half the CO2 emissions are produced today. This improvement track record will continue and accelerate. Before 2030, small electric planes can start serving some short domestic and regional routes. Around 2035, hydrogen might be possible in flights of up to a couple of hours. And sustainable aviation fuel is already in use by airlines, even if the volumes are low. With this new source of fuel, there is no need to change engines or airframes. It reduces CO2 emissions by 80% today, and by 2050 could cut CO2 almost completely. Importantly, it can be made from a variety of sources. In the next years, we expect the supply to increase and the prices to drop. That's not all. Today, we are already implementing operational efficiencies, and by 2050, ground operations at airports will become net zero. Around the world, the development of carbon removal options will help us deal with the remaining emissions. With the right support from governments, investors, and the energy industry, aviation is now aiming for net zero CO2 emissions. Because we have always been, and will always be, innovators in the service of bringing people together. Fly net zero with us.